Okay, so in the article How Gender Became the Election's Crucial Fault Line by Emily Bazelon, New York Times, the author talked about the gender roles in political affairs, specifically surrounding transgender women rights. She talks about how these issues came apparent in party strategies, with conservative sections framing these problems, making gender an important factor in elections. This article starts off as Harris wanting to become the first female president, but then takes a turn when Trump and Vance made the elections all about gender using the terms childless cat lady and calling Harris mentally impaired, and saying she's miserable while also making claims regarding women's rights. Although Harris tried to power through with female power, Trump thought of her as a threat, once again making this about gender. During the Trump campaign on July 10, he actually prioritized people of color over women for targeting, while also injecting anti feminism into the campaign. These gender roles regarding rights have shaped the US politics in numerous ways. Moving on to the next article, the misogyny of Gen Z has been overstated. The author argues against Gen Z specifically. Women are aggressive towards specifically how women are aggressive towards feminism. She talks about some of the ways social media painted Gen Z as less intrigued when it comes to women issues like gender identity, saying that we're essentially painted as more conservative. These ideologies don't really recognize the different perspectives and the way that we see things as a generation. And the author also talks about ways to overcome this issue, like handling concepts between gender and social norms in particular ways that don't align with feminism but still account for their own rights. So basically, this author strives to understand Gen Z's different perspectives. Now, in the podcast starts off by the speaker talking about a guy who went on a stabbing rampage in the mall. He killed 5 out of the 6 people, and he killed five out of the 6 people were women. Um, and when they asked the dad about this, the dad defends the son by talking about his personal issues, including his mental health, and this being the cause of his loneliness. Now, this really drives a question for the young men dealing with these issues. Is the internet a concerning factor for growing them into angry men who believe the world has done them wrong? Um, so, well, considering that 5 out of the 6 people he killed were women, then women obviously has to be a correlating factor into all of this. Um, and in this podcast, the speaker argues this to be a form of misogyny and a crisis of masculinity, because men nowadays are struggling to meet women because they think that they're not good enough since they're only exposed to a few people that nobody can get. So, as generation and time goes by, men are finding it harder to obtain women because they feel like they don't have a purpose. In the old days, men were subject to their roles as a man. They protected, they provided, and oftentimes it was easier to get a woman from their country because there was no competition. Um, but now, with social media and society playing a big role into how men are shaped and how men think about things, they are finding it harder to find a purpose. That's because, like, in the old days, they went to war, they did the traditional roles of a man, but now, like, men, they don't need to go to war. They don't essentially struggle how they did before. They just kind of lock themselves in their room and go on the dark internet all day. And the speaker argues that we need to understand what it needs to be a man in this generation. And oftentimes, these men don't understand what it means to be a man in this generation. And men aren't prepared for this new world. So, essentially, this episode emphasizes ways to foster relationships, understand and empathize even in the face of isolation, which is extremely important to moving forward in an imperfect society. Now, going on to my cultural artifact I chose was a video of Andrew Tate explaining what it was to be a man, or his perceptions on what it meant to be a man, and like his definition of masculinity. And basically, he was talking about how masculine men have a duty to provide and protect those who they care about. For example, he was saying how when you need a firefighter, you want a masculine man. When you need when you call the police, you want a masculine man, because a man needs to protect. And he made a point in this video that I thought correlated well to the podcast, which was the point he drove home, which stated that men are only cared about because of how useful they are, which I thought tied well with the podcast, because in the podcast they were talking about how women don't care about how strong you are. We care about what you can bring to the table and how you can provide and how smart you are. So I thought that went hand in hand with the video and the podcast, explaining the traditional roles of a man and what we really want out of a man. And he talks about how we are now teaching this like new generation that they have no duty and that they can act on their feelings, which was a point in the podcast. Well, he was talking about in the video, he was talking about how if you have a man that acts on how they feel, that's how they end up with more school shooters and violence, which I thought correlated with the podcast, because that's exactly what happened in the podcast. The guy who killed 5 out of 6 people that were women, he acted out of violence because of those feelings he had towards women. So basically, this whole video was emphasizing that men has forgotten their purpose because of the broken society.